Make potato water yeast. We're going to start with a 1/4 pound of potatoes, thinly sliced, just like if you're going to be making mashed potatoes. We'll go ahead and bring it to a boil and boil the potatoes until they become soft. In addition to the sliced potatoes, we're going to need 2 cups of potato water. So I would start with 2½ cups boiling to yield 2 cups once we're done. Once we check that our potatoes are soft, I'm going to turn off the heat, drain the water from the potatoes. Here's some of the supplies you're going to need to make your own yeast. I'd go with a wide mouth 2-quart jar. You're going to need either a paper towel or a coffee filter, 1 cup of flour, 2 tablespoons of sugar. And of course, something to strain your water with. So we're going to start with the water, our potato water. So this is well over 2 cups of water. You have a couple of choices. You can put this in the fridge, set it outside, but this needs to cool down to room temperature. If you use the scalding hot potato water, you're going to virtually sterilize your medium and potentially kill any possible yeast you're going to catch. So let this cool down. We're going to take the 2 cups of potato water and pour it into our jar. We're going to add 1 cup of flour, and the 2 tablespoons of sugar. And then we're going to mix this up into this nice smooth liquid. At this point, we need to capture the yeast. Now there's a couple of different philosophies on how to do this. Yeast is everywhere. It's airborne. If you have a house with HEPA filters, a sealed tight house, there's a chance that there's going to be less yeast inside than outside. You're going to have to leave this open for a while, obviously, for the yeast to enter into the jar. But while you're doing that, you also don't want flies or gnats or other things entering into the jar too. So what I have found to be best is to do this at night and then place this outside where the bugs and the things are going to be basically dormant and not flying around. But it needs to be somewhat warm. You can't put this outside where it's going to freeze and freeze your medium. So you're going to have to find a place to do this. I've done it inside the house before. There's no problems. Right now it's January and it's going to freeze tonight, so I'm just going to leave this open in my house. I don't have any flies or anything. So this is going to be left open until tomorrow morning. So it's going to be left open for probably about 10 hours. And then tomorrow morning I'm going to go ahead and take either the coffee filter or the paper towel and a canning ring, and I'm going ahead and put this on like that. This will allow the air in here to breathe, because as the yeast develop, as a colony becomes larger, they're going to be eating the starches and sugars and basically putting out carbon dioxide. And so that's why we're going to let this have the ability for it to breathe. We're going to place this in the refrigerator, and you want to monitor this for a couple of days or so. The liquid in here will start to get thick. If you're successful, you'll start seeing little air bubbles. Actually, they're not air bubbles, they'll be carbon dioxide bubbles forming down here in the solid part of the liquid, and you'll start seeing bubbles and foam being generated up on the top of the surface. Go ahead and leave this in your refrigerator for 2 to 3 days or so. And then you can start to use it. As you use it, it's going to be on about a 2 or 3 to 1 ratio with regular store-bought yeast. Sometimes it's better to use a little bit more than less. It depends on how strong your colony of yeast is going to be inside this jar. As you use your yeast, you're going to have to replenish the liquids inside. And if you don't use it, you'll need to give the yeast some food to eat to keep the colony alive. And it's recommended to use 3/4 cup water, 3/4 cup flour, a tablespoon of sugar, remove half the liquid, put the new material in, stir it up, and put it back in the fridge. And from time to time, you'll want to smell this and see if it smells like yeast. If it starts smelling funky or putrid, there's a possibility that your colony is probably dead and something happened to it, and you'll have to start over again. So this is the potato water. This is the potato water method to making yeast. I'm also working on this. I haven't used this concoction yet, but this is raisins in water, and it's supposed to smell a little bit like wine, but this has not smelled anything like wine, and you're supposed to stir this twice a day, but this does not look promising, and so I'm just going to have to see what happens with this. But there are several ways to making yeast and also starters for sourdough bread. This is really not a sourdough bread starter, this is just yeast. And so try it out. I have had success in baking bread with this, and it does work. It's totally amazing, and it surprised myself. So good luck. Next, for making bread, this is a favorite recipe of our family's called honey wheat bread. But instead of making it out of regular flour and wheat flour, because I don't have any wheat flour, I'm just making it out of straight flour. But I'm making it out of bread flour. And I'm going to double the recipe, but I will put the recipe at the end of the video. I have the commercial yeast in this container, and this is my homemade yeast. And the instructions say it's like 2 to 1, but one of the things they tell you is to smell it and see how strong the yeast is. So the proportions are not going to be quite accurate, so I'm just going to have to guess on how much of the homemade yeast to use. And I think I'd rather trial on putting more of it in there than not. And if it overrises, then I can adjust it later on. And then with that, we're going to put a little bit of the flour in there so the yeast has something to chew on. And then we're going to add warm water. I'm going to need the store-bought yeast first, and I'll use, so this is store-bought. I'll do this one first, and then I'll do the homemade yeast later on. So the store-bought yeast is in this bundle right here. This is the homemade yeast. So this dough is with the regular yeast, and I made it extra sticky to help the dough absorb the moisture. So it's still kind of on the sticky side, but that's okay. So we're going to go ahead and start kneading this. I'm going to add flour as I can to try to get this dough as smooth as possible. So rigorous kneading pretty much smooths all those little particles in the dough, so the dough's nice and smooth. So I have my bread pan, and I'm going to flour this. And put that in there. I'm going to cover it up and put it in a warm place to raise. Now this is the dough that has the commercial yeast. This is the dough that has the homemade yeast, and that's next. So you can still feel the little chunks in here, and this is still quite sticky, but after we knead it, that should smooth out. So this is the dough with the homemade yeast. So we're going to put this in a warm spot. Now, one of the things I read on the article about this, it takes a lot longer for homemade yeast to rise than the store-bought yeast, so we might have to see how this goes. I'm hopeful. This is the freeze-dried bread that had store-bought yeast in it. It rolls really, really well. So I'm very happy with this. This is called honey wheat bread. Nice and fluffy. Needs a lot of butter on it. So the other bread with the homemade yeast is still rising. It's taken a long time for that. I'm so hopeful. So on we go. All right. Good things come to those who wait. So this is our bread with our homemade yeast. It actually rose. It took 4 hours, but it actually worked. I'm excited. So into the oven it goes, and I can smell the yeast. So I'm getting very optimistic. Well, it finally came out. This is the bread that was made with homemade yeast. Still warm out of the oven. So how about that? Now, this is the bread that was made with store-bought yeast. So you can see that the store-bought yeast, this only took about a half hour to rise. This took 4 hours to rise. But this is the first time I ever made bread with homemade yeast. It was very interesting, and I'm going to have to study more about it. But how does it taste? The taste is a little bit different. It's more like a sourdough. It's kind of a cross between traditional bread and a sourdough. Now, I can imagine that happened because I guess this is how they make sourdough starter. But it's good. I started my yeast 3 days ago. So this is my homemade yeast. It's basically flour, water, and sugar. And I had to use about 3 times the amount of this yeast as to the store-bought yeast. But for my first attempt at homemade yeast, I think it went very well.